Eli stumbled through life in a haze of noise, a cacophony that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. At 28, he was a man unmoored, tethered to a job he despised in a routine that felt like a slow suffocation. The call center where he worked was a symphony of ringing phones, overlapping voices, and the relentless tap-tap-tap of keyboards, each sound drilling into his skull until he could barely think. His apartment offered no reprieve, a shoebox of a place where the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbor's television blaring late into the night, the laugh tracks bleeding into his restless dreams. Evenings were spent hunched over his phone, scrolling through feeds that promised connection but delivered only a hollow buzz of opinions, mids, and fleeting distractions. The world was loud, but the noise inside him was louder still. Doubts gnawed at his edges. Why am I here? What's the point of all this? And regrets piled up like unpaid bills, each one a reminder of paths not taken, dreams abandoned. Questions swirled, unanswerable and persistent, a storm in his mind that left him feeling like a ship adrift. No anchor, no shore in sight. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but he wasn't alive either, just existing, a ghost in his own story. One evening, the weight of it all pressed too hard, and Eli found himself pulling on a jacket and stepping out into the fading light, his breath visible in the crisp April air. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to move, to escape the confines of his four walls and the relentless hum of his thoughts. His feet carried him to a small park a few blocks away, a patch of green hemmed in by the city's concrete sprawl. The sky was streaked with the last embers of dusk, oranges and pinks bleeding into a deepening blue, and for a moment he paused, staring at the colors as if they might hold an answer. He sank onto a weathered bench, the wood cold against his legs, and let his gaze drop to the cracked pavement beneath his feet, tracing the lines like they were a map to somewhere better. The park was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of traffic, a rare pocket of stillness in his chaotic world. He didn't notice the old man at first, not until he was close, his slow shuffle breaking the silence. The man was slight, his coat frayed at the cuffs, his face etched with lines that spoke of years and stories Eli couldn't begin to guess. In his hands he carried a Bible, its cover worn soft, pages curling at the edges from use. He didn't say anything right away, just eased himself onto the bench beside Eli, leaving a respectful gap between them. Eli shifted, uncomfortable, expecting a sermon or a plea for spare change. But the man only sat there, gazing out at the park with a calm that felt foreign. After a minute, he turned his head, his eyes sharp despite the years they carried, and said, "You look like someone who's drowning in noise." The words hit Eli like a punch, too accurate to dismiss. He frowned, his mouth opening to argue, but nothing came out. The man didn't wait for a response. "God's voice is there, son," he continued, his tone gentle but firm. "But you've got to quiet the storm to hear it." Before Eli could process the statement, the man opened his Bible, the pages falling naturally to a spot he seemed to know by heart. He pointed to a verse, his finger trembling slightly. Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God," and then without another word pressed the book into Eli's hands. The weight of it surprised him, solid and real against his palms. The man stood, gave a small nod, and walked away, his figure shrinking into the twilight until he was gone. Eli sat there staring at the Bible, the words echoing in his head. Be still. He wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure he believed in a God who spoke, but something about the encounter lodged itself under his skin, a splinter he couldn't ignore. He carried the Bible home, its presence an odd comfort against the chaos of his apartment, and set it on his nightstand, unopened. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The usual noise, his neighbor's TV, the creak of the building, the hum of his own thoughts, felt louder, more oppressive, as if mocking the old man's words. He reached for his phone out of habit, thumb hovering over the screen, but then stopped. For the first time in years, he turned it off, the silence that followed sharp and unfamiliar. He lay back, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in, and felt an ache rise in his chest, a longing he couldn't name, a hunger for something more. The old man's voice replayed in his mind, soft but insistent. God's voice is there. Eli swallowed, his throat tight, and whispered into the void, If you're there, God, I don't know how to hear you. No thunder rumbled, no light split the sky, but the stillness shifted, subtle as a breath. It wasn't an answer, not yet, but it felt like a beginning, like a door cracking open in a room he'd never known was locked. He closed his eyes, the Bible a silent sentinel beside him, and let the quiet hold him, wondering what might step through that door if he dared to keep it ajar. Eli woke the next morning with the old man's words still clinging to him, a quiet echo beneath the usual clamor of his thoughts. The Bible sat on his nightstand, its worn cover catching the slant of sunlight through his window, and for a moment he just stared at it, unsure what to do. The night before had left him unsettled, not with fear, but with a strange pull, like a thread tugging at his chest. He didn't know if he believed in God, not really, but the idea of a voice cutting through the noise was too tempting to ignore. He dragged himself through his morning routine, coffee, toast, the grind of the call center, but the day felt different, shadowed by that whisper of possibility. When he got home, exhausted and frayed, he didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he dimmed the lights, sank onto his sagging couch, and let the apartment settle into a hush. At first, the silence was unbearable. His mind raced, jumping from overdue bills to a coworker's snide remark. But he stayed with it, breathing slow, waiting. Nothing happened, not that night, but he tried again the next and the next, carving out these pockets of quiet like a ritual. Days turned into weeks, and something began to shift. In those still moments, a nudge emerged, faint as a breeze, a whisper he couldn't quite catch. It wasn't words, not yet, but a feeling, gentle, persistent, like someone tapping his shoulder. One evening, restless and curious, he pulled the Bible into his lap, flipping through its thin pages until his eyes landed on John 10:27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. The verse stopped him cold. A shepherd and his sheep? The image was simple, almost childish, but it sank deep. Could God know him, Eli, with his doubts and dead-end job, his messy life? The thought was absurd, yet it warmed him, a flicker of hope in the dark. He started to pray, clumsy and halting, muttering half-formed thoughts into the quiet. God, if you were there, I don't know what I'm doing, he'd say, or show me something, anything. Sometimes he'd sit with the Bible open, tracing the words with his finger, letting them roll around in his head. One morning, as he lingered over a cup of coffee and that same verse, a memory bubbled up. His grandmother, years ago, standing in her kitchen, humming hymns while she stirred a pot of soup. She'd caught him watching once and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. God's always speaking, Eli, she'd said, her voice soft as the steam rising from the stove. You just have to learn his tone. He'd been a kid then, maybe 10, and he'd shrugged it off, more interested in the cookies cooling on the counter than her quiet faith. Now, though, her words felt like a lifeline, a clue to this puzzle he was fumbling to solve. At work, the noise still pressed in, phones ringing, voices overlapping, but Eli started noticing things he hadn't before. Small prompts like instincts he couldn't explain. One afternoon, he glanced across the cubicles and saw Sarah, a coworker he barely knew, hunched over her desk, her face tight with something heavier than the usual Monday slump. Something nudged him. Go ask, and he hesitated, feeling foolish, but the nudge wouldn't let go. He walked over, awkward, and cleared his throat. Hey, you okay? He said, bracing for a brush off. She looked up, startled, and then her eyes welled up, spilling over before she could stop them. No, she whispered, and it all came tumbling out. Her son, 6 years old, sick with something the doctors couldn't pin down, the bills piling up, the fear she carried alone. Eli didn't know what to say, so he just listened, nodding as she spoke, her words raw and jagged. When she paused, catching her breath, he fumbled for something to offer. Can I pray for you? He asked, the words foreign on his tongue. She nodded and he bowed his head, stumbling through a prayer, asking for strength, for healing, for peace. When he finished, Sarah wiped her eyes and managed a small, thank you. He walked back to his desk, heart pounding, a warmth spreading through him he couldn't name. Was that God's voice pushing him toward her? He didn't know, not for sure, but it felt right, like a piece clicking into place. That night, he sat with the Bible again, rereading John chapter 10:27, and the whisper grew clearer. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like a shepherd calling his flock across a field. He thought of his grandmother's hymns, of Sarah's tears, of the quiet he was learning to crave. Prayer became less awkward, a conversation instead of a plea, and the scriptures started to breathe, their words weaving into his days. He'd always thought hearing God would be a thunderbolt, a shout from the sky, but this was different. Soft, personal, a tone he was beginning to recognize. Lying in bed, the apartment still around him, he closed his eyes and listened, the silence no longer empty but alive with presence. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know where this was leading, but for the first time in years he felt known, tethered, like a sheep lifting its head to a familiar call. Eli carried the whisper with him now, a quiet companion that lingered in the stillness he'd come to seek each day. It wasn't always clear, not like a voice on the phone or a shout across the street, but it was there, gentle, persistent, threading through his prayers and the pages of the Bible he'd begun to know by touch. The more he listened, the more he trusted. Though trust was a muscle he hadn't flexed in years, stiff and reluctant. One evening it faced a test. His boss called him into the office, a rare break from the call center's endless churn, and slid a piece of paper across the desk. A promotion offer. More money, more hours, a title that sounded important but came with a leash of stress he could already feel tightening. Eli stared at the numbers, his bank account flashing red in his mind. Rent, groceries, the phone bill he'd dodged last month. His gut twisted, saying no, but logic screamed yes, a lifeline in a life that felt one paycheck from sinking. He took the offer home, the paper crumpled in his pocket, and sat in his dim apartment, the Bible open on his lap. He prayed, asking for clarity, and a verse rose unbidden, one he'd read a week before. Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. The whisper followed, faint but firm. Wait, it made no sense. Wait for what? But it stuck, a pebble in his shoe he couldn't shake. He wrestled with it all night, pacing the worn carpet, the numbers on the paper battling the stillness in his chest. By morning, bleary-eyed and certain of nothing but that nudge, he walked into work and turned it down. His boss blinked, incredulous, and muttered something about opportunities not coming twice. But Eli left the office with a peace that defied the math. Days later, a friend from his old college days, Mark, texted out of the blue. Drinks, catch-up, a casual invite that ended with, "Oh, and I go to this little church now, want to come Sunday?" Eli hesitated, religion still a foreign country he'd only just crossed into, but the whisper nudged again, soft as a breeze. Go. So he did, showing up in jeans and a faded hoodie, feeling like an imposter among the small crowd in the basement of a brick building. The pastor was young, barely 30, with a voice that carried quiet conviction, and he spoke on obedience. Abraham leaving his home in Genesis 12, no map, just a call. The words hit Eli square, a mirror to his own fumbling steps. Was God asking him to move, to change? He didn't know, but as the service ended, people lingered, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups, and Mark dragged him into a circle of strangers who didn't feel strange for long. He found himself talking about the old man, the silence, the promotion he'd ditched, words spilling out like he'd been holding them too long. To his surprise, they listened, nodded, shared their own stories of whispers and leaps. A woman named Grace, her hair streaked with gray, smiled and said, "It's like tuning a radio. You find the signal through the static." Her words stuck, a frame for what he'd been chasing. That night, Eli lay awake, the church basement replaying in his mind, and decided he couldn't keep drifting. The call center was a cage, the money a chain. He quit the next day, no plan, just trust. He took a part-time gig at a bookstore down the street, shelving novels and poetry for half the pay, but twice the air to breathe. The whispers grew clearer in the space he'd carved out, a steady voice guiding him through scripture in silence. One night he dreamed of a shepherd leading him through a fog, the figure blurred, but the call sharp. Follow. He woke with the word ringing, sweat on his brow, and knew trust wasn't just hearing. It was stepping out, blind but held. The bookstore became a rhythm, the church a tether. He'd sit with Grace sometimes, her Bible dog-eared and marked, and she'd point him to verses. Psalm 37:5, commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. That felt like bread for the road. He started sharing more, not just his story, but the nudges, the moments God broke through. One Sunday, a guy named Tom clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've got a knack for this, man, making it real." Eli brushed it off, but the words planted something, a seed he didn't yet see. His life wasn't perfect. Money was tight. Doubt still crept in. But the fog was lifting, step by step. He traded noise for stillness, fear for faith, and the shepherd's voice was no longer a guess, but a guide. Lying in bed, the city humming beyond his window, he closed his eyes and listened, the whisper now a lifeline. Keep going. It wasn't loud, wasn't grand, but it was enough, a signal strong amid the static, pulling him forward into a story he was only beginning to write. Eli felt the whisper settle into his bones now, a steady pulse that guided him through days that were simpler but no less uncertain. The bookstore job paid the bills, barely, and left him time to breathe, to listen, to let the shepherd's voice shape him. It led him one afternoon to a customer, an older woman named Ruth. Her hands knotted with age, but her eyes bright as she browsed the gardening section. She caught him shelving books and asked if he knew anything about soil PI, grinning when he admitted he didn't. "I run a community garden," she said, "and I could use an extra pair of hands." The nudge came, soft but clear. "Help her," and Eli nodded before he could overthink it. The next Saturday, he showed up at the garden, a scrappy plot tucked behind a row of townhouses, and found Ruth already there, knee-deep in dirt. They worked side by side, digging rows for carrots and beans, and she talked about the earth, about seasons, about God's provision. One day, as they rested under a sagging oak, she pulled a small Bible from her bag and read Matthew 6:26. "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" Eli glanced up, a sparrow flitting between branches, and felt the words land. The garden, the birds, his own shaky steps. God was weaving it all, wasn't he? Ruth became a fixture, her quiet faith a mirror to his own, and the garden grew under their care. Green shoots breaking through soil like promises kept. But obedience wasn't always easy. One night a storm rolled in, fierce and unyielding, rain hammering the city for hours. By morning the garden was a wreck, flooded beds, uprooted plants, mud swallowing their work. Eli found Ruth there, staring at the mess, her face crumpled with loss. "I don't know if I can start over," she said, voice breaking, and Eli felt the same weight, the urge to walk away and call it done. He went home, the rain still drumming against his window, and prayed, asking for a sign, a reason to stay. The whisper came, small but solid. "Stay." And he wrestled with it, the logic of quitting louder than the call. But he trusted now, didn't he? So he went back the next day, boots sinking in muck, and started shoveling. Ruth joined him, then others, neighbors, church folks, even Mark with a thermos of coffee, and slowly the garden rose again. Donations trickled in, volunteers multiplied, and by summer's end, it was thriving, a testament to something bigger than their hands. Eli saw it then. Obedience wasn't just following, it was staying when it hurt, holding ground when the storm hit. He started journaling after that, a cheap notebook filling with the whispers he caught, scripture that stuck, dreams that lingered, moments God spoke through Ruth, or the sparrows, or the silence. It made the voice tangible, a thread he could trace back when doubt crept in. Sundays at church became a rhythm too, the basement crowd a family he hadn't expected. One week the pastor asked for testimonies, and Eli's hand went up before he could stop it. He stood, heart thudding, and told them about the garden, how the flood came, how the whisper held him, how God rebuilt it through people he barely knew. His voice shook, but they listened, heads nodding, a few amens rippling through. Afterward, a teenager named Micah, all lanky limbs and nervous energy, cornered him by the coffee table. "I want to hear God too," he said, eyes wide, and Eli froze unprepared. Then he smiled, dug a spare Bible from his bag, Grace had given him extras and handed it over. "Start with the quiet," he said, echoing the old man from months ago. "He'll show up." Micah took it, clutching it like a treasure, and Eli felt a jolt. His journey wasn't just his anymore. Teaching Micah deepened something in him, like watering his own roots while tending someone else's. They'd sit sometimes, flipping through Psalms or John, and Eli would share the nudges, the way God's tone felt personal now, not distant. One evening, Ruth caught him journaling under the oak, the garden humming with dusk, and asked what he was writing. "Just keeping track," he said, showing her a page. Psalm 23 scribbled next to a dream of a shepherd, a note about Micah's questions. She read it, nodded, and said, "You're learning to obey with your whole heart, Eli. That's rare." He didn't feel rare, just stubborn maybe, but her words stuck, a quiet affirmation. The garden grew, the church group swelled, and Eli's book thickened. Each entry a marker on a path he hadn't planned but couldn't deny. Lying in bed that night, the city's hum, a faint backdrop, he closed his eyes and listened, the whisper steady as ever. Stay, share, trust. It was a call to more than himself, a shepherd's voice rippling outward, and he was beginning to see where it might lead. Eli stood in the rebuilt garden months later, the sun warm on his face, a breeze rustling the leaves of the oak that had become his quiet refuge. The noise was gone, not the city's hum or the chatter of the world, but the storm inside him, the chaos that had once drowned out everything else. He'd found clarity, not in a single blinding moment, but in the steady drip of days spent listening, trusting, obeying. The whisper was a constant now, not loud or dramatic, but a voice he knew, God's voice, soft as a shepherd's call, guiding him through the ordinary and the hard. Psalm 23 had woven itself into his marrow. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," a promise he'd tested and found true. He wasn't rich, wasn't famous. His apartment still creaked and his bank account still teetered, but he had purpose, a life reshaped by the quiet he'd learned to seek. The garden was proof, its rows of green a patchwork of effort and grace, Ruth's vision brought to life by hands that showed up when the floodwaters receded. Eli worked there most days now, part-time at the bookstore, part-time in the dirt, his hands calloused but his heart full. Ruth called him her right hand, though he'd laugh and say he was just following orders, the nudges that kept him coming back. One afternoon, as they planted a new bed of herbs, she handed him a seedling and said, "You've grown too, you know, not just the garden." He brushed it off, but her words lingered, a mirror to the man he was becoming. Church had shifted too, no longer just a place to sit, but a place to lead. Grace had nudged him into starting a small group, a handful of people crammed into the basement every Wednesday, Bibles open, coffee brewing. He'd fumble through at first, unsure how to guide, but they'd talk about the whispers they heard, the steps they took, the doubts they wrestled. Eli shared his story again and again, the old man, the silence, the garden, and it never got old, each telling a reminder of how far he'd come. He taught them what he'd learned. Start with the quiet, trust the tone, obey even when it's messy. The group grew, spilling into a second table, and Eli marveled at it, this ripple he hadn't planned. One evening, as the garden glowed with dusk, Micah ran up, his grin wide enough to split his face. "I heard him," he said in breathless, and Eli's heart skipped. "He told me I'm enough, just now, out there by the carrots." The kid's eyes shone and Eli's welled up, a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow. He clapped Micah on the shoulder, voice thick, and said, "That's him, all right. Keep listening." Micah nodded, clutching the Bible Eli had given him, and bolted off to tell Ruth. Eli watched him go, the moment sinking deep. His faith wasn't just his anymore. It was a seed taking root in others. The shepherd's call was spreading, and he was part of it, a conduit he hadn't expected to be. Nights found him in his apartment, the notebook open, pages thick with ink, verses, dreams, nudges, testimonies. He'd flip through it sometimes, tracing the journey. Psalm 46:10 on the first page, the old man's gift. John 10:27 scrawled after Sarah's tears. Proverbs 3:5-6 from the promotion he had ditched. Matthew 6:26 beside Ruth's birds. It was a map of whispers, a record of God breaking through, and it grounded him when the world wobbled. He still doubted, still wondered if he was enough. But the voice always answered, "You are mine," and that was clarity enough. The bookstore owner offered him more hours, but Eli cut back instead, pouring time into the garden and the group, into Micah and the others who showed up hungry for what he'd found. Ruth expanded the plot, a grant from the city turning it into a hub, kids planting seeds, neighbors swapping stories, a corner for prayer under the oak. Eli led it with her, his voice steadier now, sharing scripture like bread broken for a table. One Sunday, the pastor pulled him aside, eyes crinkling with a smile. "You're a shepherd too, Eli," he said. And Eli laughed uneasy, but the words stuck, a weight and a gift. Looking back, he saw it all, the noise that had choked him, the stillness that saved him, the trust that moved him, the obedience that held him. God's voice had transformed him, not with fanfare or thunder, but with whispers that reshaped his soul, piece by quiet piece. He wasn't the same man who'd sat on that park bench, lost and drifting. He was known, called, purposeful. Kneeling in the garden one evening, the soil cool under his knees, he prayed, not for answers, but in thanks, the words spilling free. He listened, the city a faint hum beyond the green, and the voice was there as always. Well done. It wasn't the end, he knew. There'd be more steps, more storms, but it was enough, a purpose to carry forward. Eli rose, the sun dipping low, and walked home, the shepherd's call a song in his heart, clear as the dusk around him.